Well, I've gotten comments in the past from folks on YouTube and in person saying, "Oh man, you should give out GMing tips or advice, and you've been GMing for 40 years, and that kind of thing." And really, I give out have a few videos here that we've talked, of course, but mostly I've avoided that, and one of the reasons is simply that I'm not necessarily sure what I would say to people. Like, uh, it's like one of the downfalls of doing this for over 40 years is simply that some of it is just second nature now, and it's sometimes hard to sit back and elucidate exactly what the process is, or even if there is a process for some things. Balancing encounters is largely just done by fiat, and then you know uh, maybe some tweaking from lessons learned, and so. But but there's no specific equation to it or stuff like that, right? Um, What it did get me thinking about, though, I thought, well, maybe I'll give it a shot. But what exactly would I talk about? And I don't know. But I think one of the first things that I need to do is get an idea of, well, what actually, before you start giving advice, what exactly are you trying to advise people to do? What do you value in a game as a GM? And so that's sort of what I'm trying to go over today are, the things that I value when GMing. What makes in my mind, a good game versus a bad game? What makes a game feel good to me and hopefully my players? Uh, so let's talk about that. Uh, so I mean, the first thing would be, the first rule, and maybe the only rule, and maybe is that everything I say here is absolutely just its opinion. It's vaguely informed opinion, but games are mostly played to taste, and as long as you're enjoying yourself and your table's enjoying your game, then you're okay. So always keep that in mind. So the requisite disclaimer is your mileage may vary. These are my opinions. I have a certain style of game. You're going to have a different style of game, and done. And both of that is, and all that is valid. So just keep that in mind as we go, and I start describing effectively what I think is a good game. Eh, you might go, I agree with that, or nah, I don't care, and that's perfectly valid. So we'll talk. Your mileage may vary. So one thing that, and it's top on my list, weirdly. So maybe it's overly emphasized, but I see RPGs as a very amazing, very unique style of game. But game is very important, and keeping it as a game is critical to me. Like, I'm not here to do a collaborative storytelling or a shared narrative, like, and my tone obviously is a little bit flippant there, but and that's fine for people to do that, but I really want, a game with mechanics, and probably a specific type of game too. um I do want some kind of, tactical element in the middle of my RPG. Be that spaceship combat, or man to man sword duels, or battles between armies, or something, right? I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be physical violence, but it typically is, because we're playing typically an action game of some sort. Um, and or mirroring sword and sorcery dime novels or whatever. But I really want there to be central mechanics. I want there to be tactical decision making, and it's been characterized as, I want a full on tactical war game in the midst, man to man, probably tactical war game, doesn't have to be, but typically is in the middle of this woven narrative. And there's more to it than that. It could also a dungeon exploration game. It could be a wilderness survival game. But there's a game in there, and we stick with that. And so, so that is the style of game that I'm typically going for, and that could be Hero, that could be Savage Worlds in the middle, could be D&D of most any edition, could be my own games, which I have gotten into the habit of writing a new game every new campaign, which I don't suggest it. it's a pain in the ass, but I want to have a game in there to put all the other stuff around. But every so often, we're going to bust out the dice and the maps and the charts and the rulers, and we're going to have some kind of war game in the middle. And again, that's not for everybody. People might go, "Oh, that's sort of gross," and it's not like it doesn't have to be all the time or every session. It doesn't have to be combat. It could be anything, but I do want a game at the heart of the role playing. And that often that sort of moves me toward games with that kind of system in them. So something like Hero or GURPS or and so on. I as soon as someone says, "Oh well, we just theater of the mind," or I'm like, I'm probably not there, right? So that's one thing I really value, because toying with those mechanics and playing with those mechanics are very near and dear to me. They're, I don't say as near and dear. They're very near and dear to the friends that I play with. We enjoy that style of game, and regardless of the story going on around it, we still want to be grounded in that type of game somewhere. And you might go weeks without having a big battle, and you might go sessions without, and you can totally do that, and we have, and we do, but at some point there's so much, there's a lot there that you can latch onto if you have that kind of tactical game with options in the middle. There's character progression that can become interesting. There's logistics that can become interesting. There's a whole bunch of these gamey decisions that then become interesting if you are playing an 80s style simulation style role-playing game. So that's the first thing. I'm very much that style of game and that style of gamer, and that's what my table is. And it's very important to me that game be interesting in the middle, and something that I can engage with, and something that my players can engage with. And so this is another one, right? I want players to be able to make decisions. I want them to have choices. Those could be choices in the narrative. Those could be choices in the game. I want players to have a level of agency which is appropriate for the campaign that we are playing. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't mean I think different levels of agency are useful in different campaigns, different games, and at different times in those games. Sometimes you have to be on rails. Sometimes and other times you can be wide open and let people do exactly what they want to do. Um, and again, it depends. This is very much it depends. I like, I want players to have agency, make choices and decisions, but I do put the caveat of it just depends. So for instance, if we're playing a hex crawler, a fantasy tabletop sword and sorcery game, then you might sprinkle some rumors and let the PCs just go at it and do whatever they want. If you're playing a superhero game that might be investigation driven or mystery driven, well, frankly, there's going to be a little less agency because you have a mystery. You have the bad guys doing a thing, and they're tracking that down. And they might have a wide leeway in how they track that down, but they don't have a wide leeway to just leave the city and go to the next city and take up shop there, kind of thing. So something to keep in mind, right? I sometimes we say, oh, player agency, and I just want people to understand that though I value player agency, I don't know that it's an absolute, because different games require different things from your table. And sometimes you're going to be on rails because this plot point has to get out the door, and other times you're going to be doing whatever you like, and your choices will have huge ramifications across the board. And that's just how it is. And as I said, in the Dawn's Hope campaign that we're playing, I think the players have a large amount of free will and the ability to actually change the landscape and change the folks that are in town, and they have it's a little bit of a sandbox for them to play in. But even in a campaign like that, the superhero game that we played previously had less aid. Why? Because, well, they were all kids in a school, and superhero games by their definition typically are reactive and not proactive, because you are usually responding to someone doing, some ne'er-do-well doing doing harm. And if your game structure is a monster of the week kind of thing, well, then you're probably doing the monster of the week. If it's a kingdom building, simulation, well, you probably have a lot of leeway in doing that. But what I do want is that, to the degree the campaign allows it, the characters can do what they want, and their decisions actually matter to us. So largely it's figuring out what that space is, and then within that space, letting them go and letting them play and explore and make decisions, and then make those decisions count. And the more that we can do that, I think the happier that I am. So this is a little bit of an odd one, but I also want things to move forward. I become very dissatisfied in a campaign where things have stagnated. And by stagnated, I mean, and that could be all over the place. That means that the story's not progressing, or the characters aren't progressing, or, there's situations just aren't changing enough. Like, I want things to keep moving. Like, one of the reasons I dislike, and it's way better now. Like, I remember when we would first play on online, and like voice chat wasn't a ubiquitous thing. So you might be playing on, it wasn't Roll20, it was like WebRPG, I think, and you would be doing chat-based games, literally typing the entire time. And one of the things that always bothered me about those games was how slow things moved forward. Now, typing everything makes everything a little more deliberate, so I think there's an advantage there in characterizing your NPCs and your descriptions, because you're typing, and so it makes it a little harder, and you think more about what you're going to say. But those campaigns moved way slower. Now, chat-based, voice-based games online move a little faster than the typing ones, but they move slower than a real life table because of the weird limitations of being on a Zoom meeting or being on Discord or whatever, and communicating that way. Um, that's a long way to just say I want things to move. Um, I want the story to move forward. Every night we should be checking off something in the plot to go, oh, well, you found these three clues, or you entered the dungeon and you cleared out the first level, or hey, your character got a new interesting power or item, or hey, your relationship with that NPC has moved to the next level, right? Like all of that, all those things. Um, the more of that you can have, I think the better. And that it could be mechanically progressing, it could be plot or narrative progression, but I want the game to feel like it is moving from, you know, from point A to point B, and we are getting them. And so yeah, but a lot of my joy and my happiness is seeing that happen, and so I do my best to make sure that we can, that we get there. Um, surprise is one. Aside from a horrible lack of talent, one of the reasons I don't just write a story is because it's harder to be surprised by yourself. Um, the fact that you were producing a situation and handing it then to a half a dozen people, and then the half a dozen people start mulling over it and come up with a solution, and they present that solution back to you, that is very satisfying. And as a GM, that is sort of what keeps me going all the time. Having done it for over 40 years, there's something about it which could get samey, but it doesn't seem to, because every situation that you present, people are going to handle it, and different people handle it differently. And the group dynamic changes with every group. So you add one person, and that's going to change the dynamic and going to change how they react to a situation. And then you're surprised again. Similarly, even on a mechanical level, characters at this stage in their progression are going to handle things differently than this stage in their progression. And seeing how that happens, and seeing, and as a GM trying to push that a little bit and go, well, okay, you guys are tougher now. Let me throw this thing in and see how you react to that. Ooh, we'll throw in a small dragon, or we'll write some wacky, and they come up and go, oh, we will use this technique or tactic that you didn't think of. And I'm like, oh, that's right. Or just being surprised by the randomness of the game. Having someone have a horrible run of bad luck or an amazing streak of crits or wounds, that's really cool. So I think the element of surprise and novelty that RPGs brings is very, very important to me. So I remember I did a brief talk on mini games or in subsystems. And I said that one of the things that I enjoy about subsystems and mini games is they bring a texture to the game. And what I mean to that is that we're doing different stuff during the game, or we're using different mechanics for different parts of the game. And so I said that could be on a bigger scale. So, for instance, we did a mystery last week. This week is a combat sort of week. Next week's going to be all talking. Could be like that. How is the story going, and what are the adventures like? It could be literally, this character has mechanics like this, and this character has different mechanics that we have to engage with, and there's an interaction there, and seeing that. So So I don't necessarily care how we get to that texture, but it's nice to feel like as we go moment to moment in the game and then week to week in the game, that we are seeing new things happen and different mechanics and different types of adventures. Like I want there to be that texture, and that's what I mean by it. Like if if it's all just talking to NPCs for 6 weeks straight, and all we do is make a couple of the same conversation roles, and we do that for 6 weeks, that's not good. That is not a good game. Like there should be, oh, we did the conversation thing tonight, and then we ended right at a combat, like a start of a combat. The second night was the big battle, and we did the big battle, and then the PCs had to recover, and so we used some healing rules and mechanics there, and then they went back to investigating, and then learned the origin of these attacks, and next week we're doing a dungeon. So and that could be natural, but maybe your game, you're like, oh, that's silly. Of course that's how you do it. And but there are games that support this real well, and games that sort of don't support this really well. I think that's one of the reasons D&D Fourth, while being a very competent tacticals mini game, didn't feel like it had support for all that other stuff. All that other adventuring stuff, the conversation stuff, the overland stuff just didn't feel like the rules supported it as well. And I think then people sort of discounted Fourth and said, I don't know, how do you want me to run this? Right? I picked up Shadow Dark, and Shadow Dark's sort of a neat game, actually, with a lot of, again, it's a neat book, and I'm certainly glad I have it, but it does seem to be very focused on that dungeon adventure, right? And that's great. And I'm sure you can do all the other stuff in there, but the game itself is very much focused on dungeon adventure. So it's leaving you to make the texture for the rest of the stuff. So I like then, so what that tells me is I like generalist games a little bit, like a hero system, which has, well, we got combat, and you can converse and make powers and spell. Like it runs the gamut of things that the game itself allows you to touch. And there's rules for most of it. So I like a generalist game, even D&D Fifth, even as bad as maybe people, you don't like it as a generalist game. You go, well, all it does is epic high fantasy. You go, yeah, but in there it does combat, and you have skill checks, and you have conversation, and right, it does avail you. That there's nothing in there that implies that all we're going to do is crawl dungeons. And so I like my game, and I like the table to have sort of different things going on at different times, and certainly different things going on each session. And then between sessions, every so often we get to maybe a big dungeon, and 2 or 3 sessions are just dungeon. And then I guarantee you we're going to go back to town, and we're going to have one session which is all town, sort of gabbing with the NPCs and catching up and moving those plots as B plots forward, right? And that's texture, and that is very important to me in a game. The last thing speaks not really to games that in themselves, but just the table. One thing that's very important to me is, I feel that RPGs are an amazing cooperative genre of games, right? If I want to play competitively, I'll pull out Eclipse or Twilight Imperium or Dune or what, right? And I'm now playing a competitive game. I'm trying to beat you all. But I don't feel that has a lot of place in RPGs unless you've all agreed that that's what you're doing. When I mean teamwork, I don't necessarily mean that you can't have PvP or you can't have players at odds with each other. In fact, some of the best games that I've had have had players very much at odds. But the meta of that was that we were still working as a team to create the best experience for everybody who was at the table. That's what I mean by teamwork. I don't mean that your character and his character can't be from rival factions and be continuously trying to one up each other or thwart each other. What I mean is that you should agree to that, and you should want to play that up so that both of you are enjoying that experience, and one of you isn't miserable about it. I've seen a lot. I mean, I'm hanging around at a game store. I've seen a lot of griping about bad games. Actually, less the past few years than years previous. So that's good. That's a good sign. Um, but the reason for most of these gripes is that one or more people at the table don't buy in to this teamwork concept. So, in a game where we're all coordinating our powers or our skills, you got one guy who's off trying to do his own thing. While everybody's making a plan over here, this guy is trying to find a way to circumvent the plan so he can do his plan. Um, and again, that's not okay. Regardless of what your character would do, you should be thinking about what everybody at the table sort of wants to do, needs to do, and how do you make this enjoyable for everybody at the table? And even as a player, I think one of the problems with this generation of D&D is simply that there's this fallacy that the GM is responsible for everybody's entertainment. And the answer is that's not true. Every player is responsible for every other player's entertainment, and that includes the GM. If you're a player and you're not entertaining the GM and your other players with your behavior at the table, then you're doing it wrong. And you should feel bad. Like, that's it. That's the whole thing. We should all be there to make this game as enjoyable as possible for all of us. And that's not to say that we condone, bad behavior, because, well, they want to do that. They're enjoying that. It actually means the opposite. It means that we should all be paying attention to each other and what everybody else needs and wants from that game, and working towards that. And that's it. I think teamwork and that social contract is super important. Now, I play mostly with friends, but I do, even amongst friends, you can sit there and go, why is that guy off doing this thing when we all thought we agreed on doing this other thing? You still have situations like that, and I think we should always be sort of aware of that and check ourselves a little bit, and if you have some clever scheme and you want to be dastardly, bring it up with the other players. Like, let them in on it. Maybe they will play along. Or they might tell you, nah, dude, don't do that, because if you do that, we're going to be upset, right? So talk about what you're doing. Be above the table. Keep most of your scheming above the table and public, so that we can all be entertained by it. Engage in the plan, even when when that plan doesn't quite fit with what you want to do. Stuff like that, right? And don't be a jerk. Largely, that's the social contract. So yeah, I think that's it. Those are the things that I sort of value as a GM, and I think we'll be talking about some of those and working. I mean, not necessarily specifically about these topics, but as I sit there and stare at these, I go, yeah, that's sort of the type of game that that we run in super general terms. And yeah, and maybe we'll talk very specifically on things like player agency, keeping the story moving forward, texture, stuff like that. So, anyway, thank you very much for listening to me ramble on, and I will talk to you later.